All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA Anticipating the Future Operating Environment, or AFO, speaker session entitled Weaponizing Critical Resources on a Changing Planet. I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Lillian Alessa, for taking the time to speak with us today. Before we get started, though, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll have a Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation. So during the brief or during the Q&A, go ahead and submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions today to Ms. Mariah Yeager. Her name is going to be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager, and questions that aren't submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed, so please make sure to send those questions to Mariah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. Lastly, make sure to keep your video and audio off for the duration of this event so that we can improve bandwidth for our speaker. All right, now I'm going to introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to her. Dr. Lillian Alessa is the director and a president's professor at the Center for Resilient Communities at the University of Idaho. She's also on the Intergovernmental Personnel Act as a chief scientist at US SOCOM. Dr. Alessa is an Arctic research specialist with 27 years of experience working across federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, and provincial partnerships. And she's published over 100 peer-reviewed papers in the fields of Arctic systems, social, ecological, technological science, advanced data science, resilience, climate science, etc. So without any further ado, Dr. Alessa, I will turn the floor to you now. And I'll stop sharing my slides as well.
Thank you, Nicole, and good morning to everyone. I am going to share my screen now so we can launch directly into it. As this is going through its paces, I am going to also say that I will take a wave top approach to this. There's quite a bit of information in here, and I'm going to take a different approach to how we're going to address weaponizing critical resources. And I understand that a lot of focus right now is on Russia. So we're going to look at that a little bit downstream while presenting three scenarios initially. As I present these three scenarios and we go through some of the underlying science behind it, keep in the back of your mind the question, is Russia weaponizing energy? Is it easy to weaponize critical resources? So the talk summary is really going to follow this sequence. Hopefully you guys can see that. Weaponization is a two-way street. So we have a philosophy problem. We are rich in philosophy, rich in opinion. Citing opinion over and over does not make it data, it is still opinion. So weaponization has emerged, just like climate and conflict has emerged, as opinion in the absence of data to support it. Weaponization as a definition is going to be about the strategic exploitation really of an opponent's lack of adaptive capacity. So mitigation of weaponization is a multi-systemic process. It is the achievement of multi-systemic resilience through something called anticipatory adaptation. It requires accurate perceptions of change to avoid something we call the drifting delta problem. Modeling exploitable scenarios requires a social science. It requires a set of data that really sit in behavioral processes rather than the geopolitical realm. Ultimately, geopolitics applies in theory to nation states, in formal governance structures, whereas the actual execution of collaborations and essentially effects occurs at the individual to individual level, that is, of human behavior. So we're going to look at an example of anticipatory adaptation in practice, and then we're going to come back to Russia and the three scenarios. So when we talk about critical resources and we talk about the weaponization of that, we have to understand that the ability to influence a primary resource such as food, water, or energy really depends on how interconnected they are in the context of a people or a region in which you are dealing. So the effects of weaponization depend on how tightly these are coupled. So the definition of weaponization that we will use today is a little bit different. So weaponization as an instrument of offense really talks about the use of something against something else. It could be at the nation state level, individual to individual level, community to community, nation state to region, and so on. Again, the way we're going to define weaponization here, and this is a critical point, is that it really is the strategic exploitation of an opponent's or a target's adaptive disadvantage. So really every group adapts a certain way, a certain pace at different scales in different configurations. If you can out-adapt an adversary or an opponent, then you can take advantage of that difference in those adaptive statuses. With respect to critical resources, you can affect them in a primary way, for example, as Russia has threatened to withhold energy directly. But in other situations, we often talk about the weaponization of water, and we talk about how, for example, China controls the Mekong and the Delta, and Cambodia, which is downstream, suffers the effect of that weaponization. But what we don't talk about is that places like Cambodia are actually minimizing the effects of that by adopting meta-scale aquaculture. It's actually easier to use the leverage of, for example, wildfire as a tool to initiate secondary and tertiary effects downstream than it is to truly weaponize a primary resource itself. So let's talk about and the weaponization effects really depend on the type of community or the type of opponent. So when we talk about regions or we talk about nation states, we actually do ourselves a disservice. Every settlement on Earth consists of a society, a culture, a group of humans that exist in an ecology, a biogeophysical environment, and utilize technologies to modify those environments or to achieve certain ends by utilizing those environments. We refer to those as social, ecological, or social environmental, and technological systems. And we contract that into something called SESs, social ecological systems. There are a range of types of settlements on Earth, ranging from large megacities to small, rural, mixed economy communities. The potential of adaptation and weaponization of critical resources really varies across this typology. So one size does not fit all. All right, let's talk about Russia for a minute, and then we're going to leave it for a minute and we're going to come back to it. So over the 30 years that I have been doing this kind of work, I have had the great honor of working with hundreds of practitioners, operators, scientists, and philosophers. And over the years, we've come up with generally three scenarios. One is benevolent overlord. It is the dynamic. For example, the historians will draw on the Roman Empire was actually more of a benevolent overlord than it was a conquering army. These today are based on historic relationships, particularly in Europe with Russia. The second scenario, resource master, that again is a two-way street. Resources require adaptation as climate changes. We're seeing an accelerated rate of climate change with the understanding that scientifically climate has always changed. It has to do with the rate, the pace, the magnitude, and the complications of that change. For example, one of the fastest rates of change on Earth today is actually direct habitat modification. That means that we are in the middle of the sixth great extinction by direct effect of changing landscapes on Earth. Resource master means that one group, a nation state or a region, adapts to a specific configuration of resources, in this case, Europe, particularly, for example, Germany standing down its nuclear energy production capacity, and Russia being able to adapt to that by providing relatively inexpensive fossil fuels. And then kill switch. Kill switch occurs when the adaptation difference between two actors is so great that one of the actors has reached a threshold where it can hold over another actor the advantages of its adaptation. In this case, Russia's ability to say to the European Union, we're going to withhold energy resources from you. Given that, however, the percent of resources that Russia is withholding is surmountable, and we will get to that here in a minute. So this is an important concept for everyone to understand, is that quite often you've read probably the resilience and resistance literature. It's actually a little bit mislabeled. So the idea of transformation in any kind of social ecological system comes from the interplay of society, so the human actors, the environment in which they live, and the technologies they use. Anticipatory adaptation requires that you accurately track change in your environment and in your own sociocultural system in order to adopt appropriate technologies. It also accepts that change is okay, that new structures and configurations may be more adaptive to a changing planet than old or legacy structures and configurations. In fact, and ironically, that's something that hurt Russia. So we aspire to a 5 or a 6. That's what we aspire to. We often sit at around a 3. And in Russia, they sit at about a 2. So the European Union is very rapidly moving up on the transformation scale, while Russia is remaining relatively static on that transformation scale. So what are the big wave top components of anticipatory adaptation? Very, very key is the accurate perception of change. That means a low delta, and I will get to that in a minute. A small difference between your perception of change and the actual change. If you perceive change incorrectly, then you have a large delta or a large difference, and that leads to maladaptive decisions. Governance and policies. We spend a disproportionate time debating governance and policies. Quite often there's enough wiggle room in them to adapt and to move up on the transformation scale. We simply don't take them. Appropriate technologies, not more technology, not the latest technology, but the appropriate technology for a given social ecological system type and for the context in which it's used and its ability to be multi-purposed into the future. Collective behaviors. Maladaptivity often comes from within organizations. It is not externally imposed. And we'll get back to that in a minute. And then, of course, acceptable trade-offs. For every action done in the goal of adapting to change, there will be trade-offs. Understanding those trade-offs is important because every one of those has a different set of negative or positive returns. There will never be a perfect solution. There will always be trade-offs. The goal is to come up with that acceptable trade-off space that meets the needs for a number of stakeholders. Okay. The drifting delta problem, and I'm going to move this over. Whoops, I'm going to move this over so you can see it. The drifting delta problem is a mathematically described state of adaptation. So at any given time, P, whether it's X0, X1, X2, with time sequences that could be on the order of days to months, depending on the type of SES, the social ecological system, there is always inherent change. And there are always actions that will change the system and put it on a certain trajectory. The onus is on us to use data, not opinion, but data to track the status of any given coupled system. If we do our jobs correctly, if we base our understanding on data, then we maintain a small delta or a small difference. In other words, we track reality fairly well. This becomes absolutely critical when we talk about forecasting futures, especially when we talk about forecasting exploitable vulnerabilities in futures, in systems that are coupled societies, environments, and technologies. If we don't do our job correctly, then we develop a large delta, and that is the drifting delta problem. If your adversary is tracking things more accurately, then what they do is they can gain the strategic adaptive advantage. In other words, their adaptation processes will be more adaptive to a future that they have more accurately described. So this is so critical that we've actually tested it in the real world. And when we tested it, and actually let me jump to this first. So I'm going to give you a real example of a drifting delta bias or a large delta. Many of you have heard or seen or maybe even work in the idea that climate change is a threat multiplier. And I'm going to just focus on one element of that, in that climate change drives conflict. We've based a lot of programs on these. We've made a lot of investment on these, on this statement, but we don't have data to support it. So what's happened is there's a divide in the practitioners who use this in practice, and then the data that doesn't support it. That potentially leads us to a maladaptive set of processes in the future that can be exploited by an adversary. All right, so when we tested this delta, this difference between perceptions and the actual instrumented environmental change, we found that there are some communities that do this better than others. And so what we set out to do was figure out why some communities do it better and why some communities do it worse. This applies to all scales of SES. So for example, Bristol in the UK actually has a small delta. Vancouver, British Columbia has a small delta. There are places, settlements around the world that have larger or smaller deltas. Over the years, over the 20 some odd years that a group of us who built the field of resilience and adaptive capacity, what we've done is we've come to consensus on some of the indicators that give us insights into whether or not a region or an SES type is more or less adaptive. Less resilience or a less resilient process often is correlated with a large delta where perceived change is off. And it's off because either incorrect data are used or perceptions themselves have been weaponized. And in the absence of data, what happens is collective belief systems emerge and data subsides. Small deltas are what we aspire to, where we use data to accurately track change. Jumping back into the European example with respect to Russia, Russia's build-up of dominance in specific energy sectors, not all, but in specific, was not something that surprised people. That was something many people saw. Europe, the European Union, for example, Germany made decisions on those trade-offs in terms of those three scenarios. Those historic relationships were stable enough to say this is an acceptable trade-off. It turns out in this case, Russia's adaptation and the European Union's adaptation trajectories were different, and Russia is in the process of trying to leverage or exploit that adaptation difference. So appropriate adaptation is sometimes called equitable adaptation. It goes back to one size does not fit all. So when we talk about forecasting exploitable futures, we first have to determine what type of SES, social, ecological, technological system, are we working with? That first step is so critical because it allows us to ask the right questions. It allows us to target the appropriate data, and that allows us to model the most likely outcomes. Quite often we have this rush to acquire as many data as possible, so many data that the signals we need are lost in the noise. To try and get around this, for the past 2 decades in earnest, a group of scientists in these fields develop different features, different components, and different linkages to the diversity of approaches that we've taken to understanding appropriate adaptation. A lot of these are intuitive and some of them are not. The important piece to take away here is that each of these are measurable, and it is important to have that measurability in order to collect the data or to find the data that already exist so as to make more appropriate and more precise predictions of the future. So if you were to take something away, it's important that you know that perceptions drive decisions, not data. Ecology constrains options. So we are constantly fighting human nature to make decisions on the path of least resistance. It is easy to have discourses in opinion. Opinions are difficult to refute. Data are not perfect, but the more data we have, the more confidence we have that what we're seeing is a closer approximation to reality. That's how we close our delta. That's how we increase precision in what we call P delta I, the perceived versus the instrumented. We don't use perceived versus reality because reality itself is something we approximate as scientists through data. Here's where it gets interesting. If we look at this pyramid, we often confuse desired requisites with primary or critical requisites. So critical requisites are life and death. This is where if we make mistakes in approximating the future, if we have a large delta, then we are exceedingly vulnerable. And it gives the adversary more opportunity or more options to exploit that large delta. The important requisites, those are things that are often substitutable, but require social change to accept that change. Humans are phenomenal creatures of habit. And because of those habits, it's easy to predict how humans will behave under certain situations. The comfort prerequisites, those are the ones we often conflate with needs. So desires versus needs. In terms of the interactions with the environment, one of the most maladaptive things that we see is a default to the way things are, the status quo, or what we call the comfort trap. So going back to what makes successful anticipatory adaptation, accurate perceptions. It is critical that we defeat the drifting delta problem, and it is doable. Those perceptions require asking the right questions, starting with the appropriate set of data for the SES type we're working in, and ensuring that we understand the suite of trade-offs so that they are acceptable. So how do you mitigate weaponization? I've gone through quite a bit of information at the wave top, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's underneath. And you'll get a little bit of a glimpse into that here in a second. I've simplified everything to three components or three features: diversity, sensitivity, and mobility, DSM. Diversity of sensors gives us the breadth and depth of data and information. Quite often what you'll see in discourse and rhetoric and opinion is that somebody will get onto, and we often call it the issue topic du jour, the issue of the day, the hot thing of the moment. And then what we see is a whole bunch of other things follow. That is not breadth or diversity. Diversity always yields resilience. Sensitivity, and so in diversity, I'm going to introduce substitutability. It is not in here on purpose. Substitutability means that if you have a resource and you lose it, if you have a plan to substitute it, then you have that diversity of resources. This becomes very, very, very important when we start anticipating contested logistics, when we start anticipating where in our supply chains could materials, goods, people, or relationships be exploited. There is one exception. Water is not a substitutable resource, but it's also outside of a few examples. For example, China's 11 dams and the Marsh Arabs, the tragedy in Iraq. It's actually very difficult to weaponize, truly weaponize. Sensitivity. Again, this is reflecting a small delta. It's the ability of institutions, networks, governance structures, whether they are formal or informal, to respond in a timely manner to perceived change. Rather than chasing realization, we want to be anticipating the future. Sensitivity requires a small delta. It also requires that we understand that informal adaptations are exceedingly powerful. We always spend a lot of time in the formal only, the governance, the policies, the laws. Those are critical, but human behavior often doesn't operate at those formal levels. At the individual to individual level, depending on the SES type, we're really looking at a power of informal adaptations. And we've seen that play out really in Ukraine. Mobility or the fluidity of responses and the ability to maintain function during sudden and adverse change feeds back into diversity. It can be a diversity of infrastructure, whether it's hard or soft, the mobility of ideas or information, the mobility of resources through alternate pathways, something Europe chose to lose. So when we anticipate exploitable futures, there's a big mystery. A lot of folks talk about coming up with futures, especially when we talk about wargaming or we do large scale assessments at multiple scales in time and space. And quite often we derive futures based on opinion, or we pull out futures that are improbable but fantastic and are kind of cool to work with. But when we put all this together, and we do have the science to put this together, that is the systems science, we would like to generate a range of likely futures. Truth is more fantastic than imagination. And when we use data to generate a range of likely futures, we actually do get the two ends and then a cluster in the middle of what we're probably dealing with. Looking at Ukraine and the tragedy unfolding there, we see that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not a surprise. The data were there. What surprised Russia really was the informal adaptation, the social organization of the people therein, and their lack of adaptation to the invasion itself. The broader European Union response in a reactive manner is also important because it sits in the potential for adaptive capacity, whereas while they made decisions to offload their ability to retain more energy independency, they did not lose the ability to organize toward it after the fact. I'm going to go through this very quickly without going into details and without wandering into any territory here. This is an actual vulnerability index. You can look up vulnerability indices. We've built many of them over the years. But I'm going to give you some insight into how the European Union was able to accelerate their transformation to a new energy configuration, including looking at the trade-offs of, for example, the windmill farms in the North Sea, because there are a set of trade-offs. The location of those windmill farms were based on a tool adapted from this. This is a very straightforward vulnerability index. It was developed because of the potential of water to be weaponized in the Arctic, which is a cold desert. The Arctic is not full of water, as many people believe. And that makes water very tenuous. So this really took a set of trust-based partnerships with communities, an indigenous approach to leverage the local and place-based knowledge therein. And it took that and it built a data-driven set of indicators and weights that took every best of class from every field of science as appropriate, with the input of a range of stakeholders, so that when the ratings come out, there is consensus that they are valid. So there is trust in the tool itself. I'm only showing you this is under the hood, because a lot of people say, well, we can't do X, Y, or Z, and we can. It's really the collective will to do it. It's not easy work, it's hard work, but the hardest work has already been done. The precision of data is what drives a lower delta. So one of the best measures of success of building this is the ease of usability. If I look at these charts, I get tired. If I look at a dashboard, I can just see which one is in the red, which one is in the green. What do I have to worry about? What do I not? And the best measure of success is the fact that it's been adapted and built out across our partners and allies globally. So let's go back to Russia, those three scenarios. And I have some questions for you. Did Russia weaponize energy unilaterally? Or did it really simply take the opportunity to exploit an adaptation deficit? I'd offer it's the latter. I'd be interested to hear your opinions on that. And there is some evidence for the latter, and that is in the EU's response. Very quickly, in fact, this is the fastest in our recorded history, modern history, that a group of countries with divergent goals in economic bases came together to come up with a plan. And this plan isn't aspirational. This is not, carbon emissions are being reduced by 2%. This is a real plan where construction has began with locations already secured to essentially become independent of Russia by 2030 with short-term stopgaps, mid-term construction, and then long-term treaties and strategies in the works. For those of you who are interested, there was a University of Southern Florida and US SOCOM joint effort to talk about Russia and the weaponization of energy. Sometimes we refer to entering a new Cold War with Russia. There are not enough data to support that. I don't believe we're entering that phase. If anything, Russia's adaptive bid is not working out very well for it, but it does create a new set of trade-offs, an increasingly hostile and isolated nation state. So my worries are not with Russia withholding energy from Europe. They're not with Russia coming over the poles in the Arctic. They are different, having to do more with the regime and the access to different types of destructive weaponry. Having looked at that, looking at Russia, which we call a binomial problem, they're relatively straightforward. They're a little bit like a bowl in a china shop, destroying beauty and order. China is a little different. China is the polynomial problem. And for those of you who are math geeks, that is the NP problem. China's reach has not been quantified. So its ability to weaponize resources or to hold us at risk in different sectors, in different social ecological system types, has not been quantified. So that means that we have an exceedingly large delta and could be surprised. When we talk about how perceptions drive decisions, it is more likely that Russia and China will weaponize perceptions themselves, leading to an adaptive vulnerability. If we look at some of the more quiet actions that have taken place in the last 10 years, they involve those secondary and tertiary effects on critical resources, as opposed to the primary or the critical resources themselves. So really, it comes down to, did Russia weaponize energy or did it weaponize an adaptive strategy? And how did that work out? And then, is China weaponizing an adaptive strategy itself so that our differences in the adaptive strategies we're taking, which one will come out better in the future? What do those exploitable futures look like? under those different scenarios, given the adaptation structures we're currently in. So if you were to take away anything from this, it's that forecasting future operational needs requires data, and that requires a systems science. We can't approach problems as a two-part problem. And we can't acquire technologies to solve single problems outside of the context of a system. Russia's ability to weaponize energy is limited. China's ability to weaponize critical resources is not quantified, and it may not work out well for them. We actually have the lion's share in the world with our partners and allies in resilient strategies. So that's the good news. The frameworks and the technologies for adaptive advantage exist, and they have been applied successfully. Collective behaviors limit their application. So as I said, on that transformation scale, the constraints on adapting successfully, ironically, often come from within. Humans are creatures of habit. They don't like to leave their comfort zones. Science is hard. It's easier to talk on opinion and philosophy than it is to sit down and find the appropriate data or ask the right questions. So really, when we talk about weaponizing critical resources, I would offer to you that it is in anticipatory adaptation where the true competition lies. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Dr. Alessa. Sorry about that. Let me go ahead and adjust our screen view. Perfect. All right, so now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of today's discussion. So feel free to submit your questions to Mariah Yeager in the Q&A chat. Okay, so Dr. Alessa, I had a question for you to get things started. I wanted to see if you could comment a little bit about China's domination or control of the rare earth metal and critical mineral market, and how that may does that display a particular Chinese weaponization of critical resources?
So this is something we discuss a lot in contested logistics. There are only a few rare earth minerals that are we currently consider relatively non-substitutable. So even though China has made it very clear and loud that they have the lion's share of a range of critical minerals, the data do not point to the ability to actually weaponize them and hold us at risk across the board. With the realization that this was going to be a problem, we have several of our partners and allies that have undertaken exploration for these minerals, and there's quite a bit of work to actually transform one type of mineral into another, into a similar function of a critical mineral. So without going into details, any more details, I would summarize by saying that even though China does have quite a large share of those critical minerals, it's not a fatal adaptive structure for us. It does not hold us at risk across the board at a scale large enough where we would consider them weaponizing that strategic advantage.
All right, thank you. An anonymous person asked if there is a defense use of critical resources, and is that weaponization just by another name?
So is the question, is there a defense use of critical resources?
Sorry, a defensive use.
Defensive use of critical resources. Well, any a defensive use of critical resources. That's actually a very interesting question. So any nation state or any region will protect its access and utilization of a critical resource, absolutely. But it's hard to say that that's an exploitation of an adaptive strategy or an adaptation configuration, because it's really more to ensure the survival of livelihoods, or to ensure the ability of a group or a region or a country to maintain what we call its normal functions. So I think I'll just leave it there. I would not say that that falls into the exploiting realm of things.
All right, thank you, Dr. Alessa. Tom G has asked, how do you suggest that we counterbalance the quote unquote need of predictability that we, the American people, prefer with the execution of your concept of mobility, particularly in the area of projecting flexible budget solutions to establish and maintain a strategic advantage in regards to critical resources?
So in the DSM construct, so that diversity, sensitivity, and mobility, and understanding that substitutability is in there, really that diversity when you have budget constraints. So our use of budgets is, I think, let's go to the budget question first. So when you look at budgets, you have to ask, is our budget adaptive? Is our allocations the budget, are they based on opinion? Are they based on data? Are they based on need? If they're based on need, where is that need coming from? Is it in the acquisition of technologies? Are those technologies appropriate? What drove that? Was it somebody saying, I need that technology so I can do X? Or was it really a systems consideration? So in terms of the mobility there, that's where we need better communication. That would be the sharing of information across the board. Quite often we acquire redundant technologies, and we do that for a reason, right? We do it for specific reasons. But I would actually go back to the diversity. When you are in a budget constrained environment, and I know from whence I speak, I grew up in a very budget constrained community. You adapt by undertaking a diversity of approaches to achieve an end. And those approaches could be through partnerships, they could be through leveraging. And in the process of doing that, of achieving that diversity in a budget constrained environment, you actually end up creating better trust-based partnerships, which are in and of themselves a commodity. So if you were to ask me what my wealth is, it is in the trust-based partnerships and networks that I have built over 30 years. It is not in anything that is paid to me. It's in those networks, because that's such a powerful commodity. So I think that's a question that if the presenter, if the proposer of that question would like to discuss further, that's a little deeper of a conversation than we can do here, just given our limited time. But it's a very good question.
Well, thank you for tackling it. This next questioner asks, the DoD is not known for its DSM, diversity, sensitivity, and mobility. Which do we need to work on first, and where do we have more leverage?
Now that is a beautiful question. In the DoD, we have several offices that can lead by lowering our delta. And that's such an easy lift, or making our delta smaller, by understanding what it is we are dealing with now and where the trajectory is going into the future. By doing that across the board, and we can do it, we actually do have the data. And in the last few years, we even have the computational power to use the right data by asking the right questions. That is the biggest bang for our buck right now. So it would be by starting with the diversity and the diversity of data to basically say, where are we on our drifting delta? And that could be assigned to anything from our infrastructure, our DoD infrastructure, our contested logistics. We do worry about contested logistics, particularly for me in the Arctic, in austere and remote environments. But we also have a way to be very targeted and precise about what we need to worry about most. Otherwise, we worry about everything. We have neither the human capital, the budget, or really the ability to worry about everything. So if we tackle the drifting delta problem using a broader diversity of data in a systems context, that would move us forward significantly. So the good news is we have the means to do it. We have the data to do it. We actually, as a nation, partners and allies, we built the science to do it. So that's where I would start.
Well, thank you for addressing that difficult, hard-hitting question. All right. So I have a question for you next. I noticed that you in the brief had talked a little bit about the relationship between climate change and conflict. You mentioned that there isn't really data out there yet that supports it. But one of the findings that SMA in our anticipating the future operational environment effort has found is that in the system dynamics model that we're creating, there's quite a strong connection between climate change and conflict. So could you speak a little bit more about the relationship between the two in your findings, at least?
So the findings they're done by colleagues that do large scale meta-analyses, and these meta-analyses, what they do is they take events and they eliminate something called the streetlight phenomenon in data science. So in data science, quite often access to data or a signal can lead to a sampling bias, and those sampling biases can be very, very powerful. So and if I can drive my computer here, I can drop in an excellent paper that was one of the largest longitudinal and cross-sectional meta-analyses of climate and conflict. So the good news is it showed that cooperation actually occurs more often than conflict. And I know that people are going to be sending me hate mail. I understand that. I am not saying that we should ever stop looking at that problem, but the data simply don't support it because what it does show is that when we report climate and conflict, we're actually reporting a bias. It's just a data bias. So it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that it is not the dominant or preponderant configuration of how human societies deal with abrupt change. So I mean, I think we should feel good that humans are more likely to cooperate than kill each other. But it's certainly something that remains a question that we certainly need to do more work on.
Well, thank you for your insights there. That's really helpful for our efforts. So the SOCOM WGC asked, how do we take the science and processes that you describe in this brief and apply them to our strategic objectives at the COCOM level and above?
So more good news. We are trying to do this now, and because SOCOM, and again, the disclaimer was written a couple of times, so I am speaking as DOC. I am not speaking for SOCOM or DoD or the university system or any of my affiliate university and memberships. DOC is saying that SOCOM actually has the best skills in its DNA. So we have vast AORs. but we work by, with, through. So we automatically, or SOCOM rather, automatically has access to a diversity of service worldviews, experiences, and data sets. So the way we do it is we pick a pilot. And in that pilot, we look at what's been done, because quite often we repeat the same thing over and over and over, and then we come up with an answer, and somebody like me says, oh, have we gone back in time? Is it 15 years ago? So we look at the AOR, we look at what's been done, and we then see what is missing. And quite often what is missing is an assessment of that asymmetric or the weak signals in the data. Understanding those weak signals in today's world, particularly when we're dealing with China in particular, gives us massive insights into how to mitigate some of the potential exploitable vulnerabilities that we have now and in the future. The good news is we are trying to do this. We are trying to do this. We've just started doing this. If anybody and their dog is interested in hearing more about that, please just email me.
All right, thank you, Dr. Alessa. All right, so we're running a little bit short on time. I wanted to give you the opportunity to give us any sort of closing remarks, any things that you would really like to, points that you would really like to drive home as we wrap up today.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is something that we do well. We lead the world in, and we're always looking at something being imposed on us from outside. Quite often, the ability to mitigate what we perceive as a threat is really an opportunity for us to achieve that strategic adaptive advantage. So I think it's really time that we understand that we got it. We have a set of threats out there. They are real, but we also have an enormous amount of potential that we have not realized completely or fully within ourselves. For example, transforming the way we even do war games would catapult us forward in terms of accelerating that adaptive transformation. It would give us truly the cutting edge in anticipatory adaptation. So the sky is not falling yet. And we have the opportunity to ensure that the sky always remains the color of freedom, of democracy, and of global partnerships. So have hope, we can do this. And that's about it.
All right, well, excellent. Thank you so much for your time and your insights, Dr. Alessa. We really appreciate you speaking to us today. And thank you to our audience members for both tuning in today and for submitting your questions. We greatly appreciate it. And stay safe and make sure to join us for the next one.